Great. Well, thank you all so much for being here for tonight's program. It's Working Class Politics in the Current Moment with Michael Zweig and Amy Goodman. My name is Diana Suri. I am the Program and Events Coordinator for Brooklyn for Peace. Before we begin, we do want to take a moment to ground us and acknowledge that we gather on unceded land of the Lenape people who were violently displaced. They cared for this land for generations, and this is something we should acknowledge, not just on Indigenous Peoples Day, but every day. We need to remind that land acknowledgement must be paired with ongoing commitment to truth, justice, and solidarity. So let us honor the Lenape people's past, their present, and their enduring legacy. Since our founding in 1984, Brooklyn for Peace has worked to prevent war and challenge the social, racial, environmental, and economic injustices that have fueled violence. And thanks to all of our members' support, we've sustained our work for over 40 years. That's something we're very proud of, and we're very appreciative of everybody's participation, donation, and help, and just showing up. And in that spirit, we're really excited to announce and invite everybody to our upcoming annual Pathmakers to Peace fundraising gala. It's set for Thursday, December 4th. It'll take place in Crown Heights. We're really excited about our honorees this year. 3 individuals who have done so much to further the work of peace and justice. The first person we're honoring is Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez of Congressional District 7. The next person is human rights and justice advocate Mahmoud Khalil. Also Palestinian American organizer, grassroots organizer Iman Rashid. She is the person that does the Gaza Signs campaign, if you're familiar. And then our last award is a combined award to organizations that have done neighborhood-specific work. And so it'll be a combined award for New York 8 for a Gaza ceasefire, New York 10 for Palestine, and 139 for Palestine. So we hope everybody can come and join us for a special night of solidarity and peace building, and also, importantly, fundraising for Brooklyn for Peace so we can help sustain our programming and our staff. There is a paper on the check-in table if you guys do want to check that out. There's a QR code for tickets and info. But now for tonight's program, I want to introduce Michael Zweig, who is the founding director of the Center for Study of Working Class Life, the Emeritus Professor of Economics at SUNY Stony Brook. He serves on the New York State Coordinating Committee of the Poor People's Campaign and the Executive Board of United University Professions. And he's been a lifelong labor and anti-war organizer. His books include The Working Class Majority, America's Best Kept Secret, and Religion and Economic Justice. Tonight's conversation centers on his new book, Class, Race, and Gender, Challenging the Injuries and Divisions of Capitalism. Copies are available for purchase. They're $20. If you guys did donate to tonight's event, you can always just contribute the difference and receive the book. We also want to thank tonight's co-sponsors, the Peace and Social Action Committee of the Brooklyn Monthly Meeting, United University Professions, Peace Action New York State, United for Peace and Justice, Peace Action Bay Ridge, and the New York Poor People's Campaign. Now let's get started. Please join me in welcoming Michael Zweig and Amy Goodman.
Thank you so much. Michael, I can't think of a more important time for this book to come out, Class, Race, and Gender, Challenging the Injuries and Divisions of Capitalism, in the midst of this lead up to the mayoral race. Now, I wouldn't say that most mayoral races are a turning point in a city's history, but this one certainly could be. Now, the establishment, certainly some in the establishment, to say the least, get riled up when they hear about the Democratic Socialist candidate, Zoran Mamdani. But others get activated to a level this country, I think, has been absolutely shocked by. And I think it goes to the thesis of your book. And I was wondering if you can talk about why some run away and others are so attracted. And if you think, because often you have people who are less wealthy being less likely to vote, if this really could turn around in 2025 and Zoran Mamdani's race could be a bellwether for the country.
Well, that's what everybody wants to know.
Speak right into.
I'm speaking right into the microphone. I'm almost swallowing the microphone.
Perfect.
Perfect. Okay. Everybody wants to know if this is it, or what are we doing? And I think that it helps to put the Mamdani race in the context of the whole country, and that in the context of the last 80 years or 90 years really of American politics. Because the interest in democratic socialism is really an interest in how do we challenge capitalism. There are people increasingly understanding that it's not just the environment that they are dealing with, or the cost of housing, or racial inequality, or women's rights. All of those things come out of the same difficult dynamics of capitalism. If you think that Trump came from just Trump, that's not right. He came out, and the movement that he represents came out of the resistance all the way back to the New Deal. And before that, even all the way back to Reconstruction, people were against it. And what we are seeing now in the context of the Mamdani campaign is that history of reaction to the limits that were put on capitalism by social movements, by the labor movement, by the women's movement, by the environmental movement, all kinds of different social movements over the decades. But in the last, well, certainly since the end of World War, since the New Deal, let's put it from there, what we've had is a systematic attempt by the capitalists to roll back every gain. And when we were coming up in the movement, and so many people here remember the movement, capital T, capital M, of the 60s, 70s, that was a movement where there were so many different elements, so many different strands that were challenging the authorities. And no matter which part of it you were in, you'll recognize that you were part of it with everybody else. And the ruling class understood that too. And they were just terrified. It's hard to remember what life was like in this country in 1967, 68, 69, 70, 71, the way in which the system was in ill repute. Everywhere, in church pews, in academic life, in political life, in cultural arenas, the capitalist system was under attack. Now, one of the things that I do in the introduction of this book is I bring out the Powell Memorandum from 1971. Lewis Powell, if you remember, was a Supreme Court justice, but before he was a Supreme Court justice, he was a white shoe corporate lawyer in Richmond, Virginia, and he was asked by the Chamber of Commerce to write a memo. What should we do because we're so much under attack? That was the question that was posed to him, and he wrote a memorandum. It wasn't secret particularly, but it wasn't published. And he said something very profound, which brings us to this moment. What he said in that memorandum to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is, we are under attack as a system, and we cannot respond industry by industry. It's not good enough for the oil industry to go and have their interests represented. It's not good enough for the auto industry or the milk producers or whoever. We have to pool our resources, he said, and we have to challenge the attack on the system by defending that system. Well, you know what? They went and did it. That was published in was written in 1971, and the 1970s, the Heritage Foundation was founded, the Cato Institute was founded, the American Legislative Exchange Council was founded, the Federalist Society was founded, all the different institutional forms. The Business Roundtable never existed, but the Business Roundtable, for those who aren't familiar with it, was formed in 1972 or 73, and it brings together the CEOs of the 200 largest corporations and the major government policy people and representatives. And they meet 4 times a year. And what do you think they talk about? They talk about the system and how not just their industry or their business can gain. Of course, they're interested in that and they do that on the side, but they're also thinking about the system and what can we do to push back every possible gain that was made. And that's the context that we're living in now. What we see with Trump is like the end zone dance of 50 years of these people trying to destroy us.
And yet, how do you explain that he appealed to people, working class people, and people of even less means, although he hurts them the most?
I think a lot of that is actually overblown. If you look at the support that Trump has in the less educated populations, which is the marker for class, it's mostly small business owners. Yes, there are workers. Yes, there are construction workers and Teamsters and auto workers and other people who support Trump. That's right. We can talk about where was the Democratic Party, who left these people in the lurch when this attack and grab back that's been going on has been happening for 50 years. Who was defending working people? Answer, nobody in the political realm. The Democratic Party collapsed as a representative, if it ever was, of working people. And so you have a degree of frustration and a degree of a sense of abandonment that people feel, and so they are looking around. And the world is a mess. There's a certain attraction to a bully and a strong man. But I wouldn't want to say, oh, it's working people who put Trump in power. Working people did not put Trump in power. A number of people voted for him, that's true, but the base of his support is in small business owners, is in some higher level professional people, and of course, big money.
Talk about the intersection of class, race, and gender.
Well, class and race and gender are distinct and separate things that you can talk about, but they're also intertwined and mutually determined. So if we just take class and race, which is obviously continues to be an extremely central feature in American political life and social life. Everybody knows that we had slavery, except maybe in Florida, they're not so sure. But we can, I think, here all agree that there was slavery. But what's often forgotten is that it was racial slavery. It wasn't just slavery. People could have enslaved or tried to enslave the British colonial leadership, the whole of the laboring population in the 17th century, but they didn't. Why not? Because they wanted to divide that working population. So they enslaved a certain part of it while not enslaving another part and letting that part, who became white, didn't start out being white, obviously were pale in complexion, but white as a social category didn't get invented except in the course of 100 years of enforcing this new separation and this new division among working people, which was designed, as all divide and conquer stratagems are designed, to limit the power of the people who are oppressed and who are being divided. And we can see similar things going on around gender issues, where people are told and taught that there are these differences, and men are supposed to be above and superior to women, and women are supposed to pay attention to what men say, and women are supposed to be in the home. And that's yet another division that's promoted. That's a false division, in the sense that it doesn't have to be that way. In the sense that we don't have to have those divisions if we recognize that what the real division is a class division. But that's a dangerous thing, and the ruling class doesn't want us to think about that. They don't want those experiences of unity to be developed. And so there's every attempt to divide people by race, by nationality, by gender, and every other way, in order, and it is a deliberate policy. I don't want to go into conspiracy theories, but people do know that it's important to divide their opposition. That's not a secret. And they act accordingly. And we should act accordingly. We should not fall for that. Now, how do you do that is a part of what politics ought to be.
Well, you talk about connecting the dots across issues.
Right.
Militarism, environmentalism, cities, privatization. If you can talk about how you do that and how you feel it's most important. I mean, you're a professor. What are the biggest challenges in teaching these issues and the connections?
Well, let's start with the connections and then the challenges. So I mentioned before the power of the movement, capital T, capital M, was that there were all these different strands, but whatever strand you were in, you recognized the comradeship that you had with the other strands, and that you were all in a common struggle against a common enemy, the system, which we then came to understand as capitalism or imperialism, however you wanted to describe it. Well, what made those different movements focused on the same target was that the complaints that they had about the environment, about racism, about poverty, about injustices, have their common origin in the structure and in the mentality of and the culture of capitalism. And so that chapter 6, the connecting the dots, was my attempt to look at 4 different parts of the movements that we are experiencing today, and looking at, for each one, how does that trace back to a common origin? And that's what I was trying to do in that chapter. Now, why is that difficult? It's difficult because you're fighting a culture, you're fighting a mass media, which you know so well, and why your program is so important, is because we need every possible resource to expose these connections and to look more deeply at each one of these movements to see how they do come from a common origin. And that's a politically challenging thing to do, especially with the regime that we have now in power in this country that seeks to just strip academic life of any opportunity to challenge the authority of capital. I mean, and they say so. They're not hiding it. It's you know, anybody who wants to talk about racism and slavery, except that how good it was that it gave people skills, is an enemy of the people. Well, you know, if you're talking that way, or you want to talk about the environment, you get no help from this government. You get opposition from this government. So what makes it difficult is that it is a confrontation of power. And power doesn't like to be confronted, and they make it difficult for us to challenge them, and that's what we're living with. And that's why these kinds of discussions that we're having here in this book and your program are so important, I think, for building the kind of understanding in the context of social movements, that walking on 2 legs of theory and practice, that I think is so important for what we do.
We had you on with Reverend William Barber last year.
Yep.
You are both, he's the head of, and you're involved with the New York chapter of the Poor People's Campaign.
Correct.
Explain what that is.
The Poor People's Campaign? The Poor People's Campaign was
And of course, Bishop Barber, Reverend William Barber, wrote the foreword to this book.
yes. And I was very pleased to be working with him. I was down in North Carolina when he was doing Moral Mondays, monthly Mondays, Moral Mondays. And one of the things that impressed me was that he really was trying to build a broad social movement that confronted power in North Carolina and did it in a way that recognized one of the most important points that's often forgotten when we talk about poverty, is that most poor people in this country are white. And that if we're going to talk about poverty, we have to talk about it in its entirety and not allow that pigeonholing of, oh, I know, poverty, those are black people. Well, disproportionately, poverty is in the black community, that's true. But because there are so many more white people than there are black people in this country, there are many more white people in poverty than there are black people. Except we don't usually think about it that way. And then also what we don't often think about when we think about poverty, and Reverend Barber was going in this direction, was that poverty is not something that happens to some marginal other at the bottom of society. Poverty is integral to the society, and it's integral to the conditions of life of working people. So if you want to do something about poverty, you have to address the conditions of labor. And what I found, that was Reverend Barber was interested in that, and that we could have those conversations. And he wrote this forward because he appreciated the work that it represented and the ideas that it represented. And as the Poor People's Campaign grew and developed, I worked with it. I worked with him and with other people on a national level through U.S. Labor Against the War. We brought the labor movement and the anti-war movement into the movement around poverty, again, seeing the interconnections among all those things. And so that's where that came from.
And of course, Bishop Barber took over the Poor People's Campaign, the idea that was put forward by Dr. Martin Luther King.
Right. That's right. Martin Luther King, in the early part of 1968, or late 1967, started to think about poverty and racism in this country and thought, well, you know, if we have the civil rights legislation and we can we can go sit at the lunch counter, but if you don't have money to buy the hamburger, what are you doing at the lunch counter? So, you know, the economic conditions of poor people have to be addressed. And they have to be addressed, and this is something that King understood also, among white people as well as black people. So when King tried to develop the Poor People's Campaign originally in 1968 in order to bring the question of poverty forward, that was what was driving it. However, he was, of course, assassinated, and it dissipated after that without his leadership, and as the whole country went wild. So Barber and Reverend Liz Theoharis at the Cairo Center decided, well, let's put this together and see whether we can resurrect, to no pun intended, this Poor People's Campaign in the current climate. And they set it up in 2017, and then in 2018 it was formally launched. And like I say, I was involved with that, and through the labor movement and through U.S. Labor Against the War. And then we, you know, we kept working together, and here it is.
Tomorrow on Democracy Now!, we're going to be looking at the Voting Rights Act, the Supreme Court hearing the oral arguments today on a case from Louisiana that could completely gut it. And when we had you and Bishop Barber on last year, he was most concerned about the fact of who would vote, that the people most hurt and affected by policies are the least likely to vote, which was what the most, maybe you could say, well-endowed classes depend on, the ruling classes depend on. Now, Zoran Mamdani seems to have turned that on its head. I mean, I think, you know, at the beginning, when he had less than 1% name recognition, Cuomo almost 100% name recognition, across the country, those ruling classes didn't care that much until, has he really turn these formulas and equations on their heads? Have poorer people in New York City voted? Because he trounced Andrew Cuomo, who represents the same interests, or at least the same people that are pouring millions into supporting President Trump are doing the same for Andrew Cuomo.
Yeah, well, what Mamdani was able to do through very skillful media and through very skillful organizing and mobilizing, street organizing, he was able to bring a message to people that resonated. That it was a message that said, we're through with the billionaires, we're through with all this money, we want an affordable city. And it is not an affordable city. It just isn't. Even for people who are making reasonable amounts of money, it's not an affordable city. Unless you've been here for 45 years or a lifetime from your parents and you inherited something, or you bought in Park Slope in 1973. This is a tough town. And I think to take it back to the Powell Memorandum, there was a way of bringing a systemic class force on us. And what Mamdani is doing, without exactly articulating it this way, but what he's doing is mobilizing that class force to challenge that, which of course scares the bejesus out of the people who run the country. They don't want that. The Democratic Party leadership for sure doesn't want it, which is why Hakeem Jeffries and Senator
Schumer,
whatever his name is, Schumer, who incidentally, if you're unhappy that the senator from Massachusetts, Al Franken, remember Al Franken got pushed out? People usually blame that on Gillibrand, which there's a reason for that. But the New Yorker had a very interesting article that showed that it was really Schumer who pushed him out, because he wouldn't defend him despite the pleadings of Al Franken and his allies, because he was just too left and they didn't want it. And they don't want to hear anything about this, which is part of the reason why the Democratic Party is a bankrupt party, literally bankrupt. They don't have any money. They don't have any support. They don't have any, it's basically dead. We can talk about what to do about that and where this resurgent movement ought to be focused.
Okay, where?
I think inside the Democratic Party. Third-party politics in this country is not in the cards. We had a Labor Party. I was very deeply involved in organizing that with Tony Mazzocchi and a bunch of other people. We had, from my union, we had 11 delegates paid by the union.
That union was?
UUP, in the United University Professions, which represents now about 40,000 faculty and professional staff in the State University of New York. In 1996, we had 11 or 12 people who were official delegates to the founding convention of the Labor Party, where there were 1,400 workers from all over the country. And it was great, and there was energy, and they really debated issues. But the Democratic Party had a grip on the labor movement. You can't have a Labor Party without the labor movement. So I took from the dissolution of the Labor Party, the failure of the Labor Party, because it couldn't break the labor movement from the Democratic Party, that the task is to build a real working class pole inside the Democratic Party. That's what we have to do. And that's what Zoran is doing inside the Democratic Party. Right? He's not running an independent campaign somewhere off in the clouds someplace, like some people do or want to do or think is important or necessary to do. The fight is to have a an organized political form that can challenge capital. Now, in labor management relations is governed by, in private sector, still by the Wagner Act. In that act, Section 882 of the Wagner Act says you cannot have management interference in the internal affairs of a union because labor and management have opposite interests. They have to be distinct, and they can meet in collective bargaining. But the law recognizes that labor and capital are distinct and have distinct interests and must be represented distinctly. We have to take that into politics. The Democratic Party, as long as it's beholden to capital, is a capitalist party. What we have to do is develop within the Democratic Party over time the kind of insurgencies that can transform it into a real working class force. A force that brings together working populations together with other social movements into one coordinated movement, the movement, capital T, capital M, 2.0 in the modern lingo, I guess, so that the political forms of resistance in the electoral sphere, I think, need to come from inside the Democratic Party, which is what AOC did. It's what a lot of other people around the country have done and are doing, what Mamdani represents, what this oysterman or lobsterman up in Maine represents. There's a lot of stuff going on. And I think we should recognize that and try to build within the Democratic Party over time. It's not something that you do just in 1 or 2 election cycles. And I'll just say one other thing in this regard. Politics, to me, has 2 pieces. It has the electoral part and it has the movement part. And as between those two, the movement part, to me, is the dominant part, has to be the dominant part. Because those movements identify issues, those movements throw up leaders, and those movements are also the bodies that can hold those representatives accountable.
I want you to talk about the different forms of socialism. You have a chapter on that. But I was wondering if you can address, in Mamdani's campaign, it's very specific. Talks about free buses, free childcare, city-owned grocery stores, rent freeze. One of the things he looks at, for example, with free childcare is how you actually make money when people are able to work. And with free buses, the amount of time it just takes for people to pull out their cards, for people to pay, for people that money going into overtime for bus drivers, you can subsidize buses. But talk specifically about this.
Well, the word socialism can mean many different things, obviously, and it has over time. To me, we can talk about socialism as a social system, as a way of actually organizing society, or we can talk about socialism as a way of thinking, as a way of analyzing capitalism. So there's those 2 different ways of understanding, and each one then divides further. So to me, the basic idea of socialism is to enhance the power of workers. Socialism is the political aspiration and organizational form, if you want, of working class people. So I would say anything that enhances the organizational capacity, the material conditions, or the cultural resources and intellectual resources of working people, that's a socialist program. And if you put it that way without saying, oh, it's the government that has to take over everything, or it's the government that it runs every business and every mom and pop store, and don't get into that. The idea is anything that increases the political capacity, the intellectual capacity, the economic and social well-being of working people and reduces suffering and reduces injustice, well, let's leave injustice aside because that's a freighted term. Suffering is pretty clear. Anything that reduces suffering, anything that increases the capacity of working people, I'm for it. I'll call that progressive. Anything that stands in the way of that, I'll say I'm against it. I'll say that's what the capitalists want. And in that way of thinking, Mamdani is in the socialist camp. Now, within the socialist camp, there are people historically who said, well, we have to do this through electoral means. Others say, no, we don't. We can do it through revolutionary forms, and all of those kinds of debates are rich. And in this book, I do address that, and I will say, we are not living in a revolutionary moment. Now, I know some people may not agree with that, or may not want that to be true, or think that it's just around the corner, stick around. I'm going on the basis that we are not in a revolutionary moment, so we're in a reform moment. So if you look at how do you do reform, that's that combination of social movements as the drivers, but then you have to have somebody who's going to implement the policies, and that's in the electoral realm. You have to have both. And I think that what Mamdani represents is that. What Jayapal, Premier Jayapal represented out in Seattle is exactly that. She came out of an environmental movement. She represented real challenge to capitalist power in the Pacific Northwest. She was recognized by the community as a leader in that way. They elected her, they sent her to Congress. There's a progressive caucus that she helped to run. And we need to build on that. And we need to build on it by holding forth on what do we really mean by social democracy or socialism. And that's what I said before. Anything that increases the material conditions, the intellectual and cultural conditions of working people, sign me up.
Where does religion fit into this picture?
Well, religion, like everything else, is conflicted by class. There's class divisions and class schisms in every religious sphere. And again, if you go back to the time of Lewis Powell in the late 60s, early 70s, the religious communities in this country, whether they were Jewish or Christian, at that time there wasn't that much of a Muslim community to really present itself. But if you look back then, those religious communities in their leaderships were seriously anti-capitalist. They might not have been communist, but they were certainly anti-capitalist. So that the Methodists, for example, the Methodist Church every year would bring their parishioners from all over the country, from Oklahoma and from Wisconsin and from Washington State and Louisiana. They would come to New York to go to the United Nations and learn about world affairs. And who did they invite? They invited me, and they invited Bill Tabb, and they invited some other lefties to come and talk about imperialism. Why are we in Vietnam? What was that war all about? What is NATO and all those kinds of things? The Methodist Church at its leadership was trying to find ways to explain to their parishioners what was going on in the society in a more deep way that opened the door to us. Well, that, I taught Marx and socialism and various other lefty things at Stony Brook, and I think in 1986 or something like that, or 85, this guy comes into my office. He's a young guy. He wants to audit my class on Marx. So we get to talking a little bit, and turns out he's a Catholic chaplain at Stony Brook. And I think, oh, really? I want the Catholic chaplain in the front seat of my class every class period. I'm the Antichrist, and what are you doing, and God this and God that. He's the guy who taught me about liberation theology. Liberation theology, which is an expression of working class and oppressed people's needs and interests through the religious lens in the Christian church. Reverend Barber comes out of that tradition. Reverend King was in that tradition. But that's not the only tradition. So part of what happened in the aftermath of the Powell Memorandum was that in every one of these religious denominations, the right stepped forward and said, no, 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 we're not going in for this liberation theology stuff. That's not what Jesus said, right? What Jesus said was, men should be obeyed. What Jesus said is, it's good to make money. What Jesus said is, if you're at the bottom, you should pay attention to and do what people at the top say. There's a whole theology, there really is. People argue within every religious denomination. And in the Jewish world too, you know, we talk about Israel and we talk about Netanyahu and we talk about the horrors of Gaza and the horrors of what's going on with the Palestinians. It's a right-wing corporate regime that is running Israel, not just with regard to the Palestinians, but with regard to the Israeli working class itself. So those challenges in every one of these religious denominations reflect class differences and class struggle. So there's class struggle everywhere. There's class struggle in the culture, in religion. And again, I come back, Lewis Powell understood that. The capitalists understand that. We need to understand it, and we need to organize accordingly. And I think we can. And I think Mamdani has that understanding. I think AOC has that understanding. I think that Cori Bush has that understanding. I think a lot of people have that understanding. We just have to organize it and make it, you know, an organized form.
Do you think Marjorie Taylor Greene has that understanding? And let me say, I mean, you can see this transition that is happening right now, where she is siding with the Democrats, not only over the Epstein files, but now saying that her child at the end of the year is facing double the health care costs for insurance that, that he was facing now. And this issue that has shut down the government of Democrats saying they have to ensure these subsidies for health care in this country, for the Affordable Care Act and the cuts to Medicaid. Can you comment on this? It's something that seems to have increasing support right now.
Well, I'll say, let me start by saying, if you're not doing politics with people you can't stand, you're not doing politics. Let's just start with that. So, okay, I'm happy to do politics with Marjorie Taylor Greene around this question or around any other question that advances the interests of working people. If she wants to come along, fine. The problem comes when it's Marjorie Taylor Greene as the representative of let's have health care, and it's Lynn Cheney as the representative of let's have democracy, and if it's Lynn Cheney and Marjorie Taylor Greene that are leading the charge, right, against fascism in America, we got a lot of problems. We got a lot of problems, which is why I think it's so important to build a working class presence in this anti-fascist moment that we have. That's why it's so important to try to bring the labor movement into this as a force that challenges capital. Now, they don't want to do it. That's a problem. So we in the labor movement, and I come out of that in the AFT, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to build that, and there are people in the Teamsters, there are people in SEIU, there are people in UFCW, there are people in all kinds of unions working together to try to do this the way that we built U.S. labor against the war. But it's a difficult slog.
I mean, it's really interesting that the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, just said, I mean, after President Trump signed the executive order calling Antifa, which is not an organization, it is a movement. You're not a member of Antifa as an anti-fascist, but calling it a domestic terrorist organization. And now Attorney General Bondi, right, who runs the Justice Department, which brings charges against people, says we will treat it like we treat drug cartels. And we know what they're doing when they claim they're confronting drug cartels is they bomb them.
Yeah, well, we're dealing with killers. We're dealing with murderers. And I will say, in President Trump's favor. In his first term, there was a question about his relationship with Putin. And one of the commentators or one of the journalists asked him, well, Putin kills people. And Trump said, well, the U.S. kills people all the time anyway. What are you talking about? Of course we kill people. What's the matter with that? So they're right up front that that's what we're dealing with. And I think that that's, again, comes back to we got to do these things together. We have to have movements that take this on, but we have to understand who we're dealing with. And that's who we're dealing with. We're dealing with stone cold killers. And that's what fascism is. And, you know, what can you do? These are people who took my grandparents and put them in boxcars and sent them to Riga where they never recovered. Those were white people. Those were civilized people. Those are the people who right now are trying to run the country.
Do you think this government can recover from the number of thousands of workers who've not just been furloughed, but fired? Government is slowly being taken apart.
Well,
maybe not so slowly.
I don't know. You know, there's this taco thing Trump always chickens out. He fired a whole bunch of people the other day from the CDC, and the next day they said, oops, guess we don't want to do that. So they hired him back. So, you know, we don't know at that kind of granular level, but overall, I think the destruction that is being wrought on this country right now is going to be very hard to undo and very hard to reconstruct the quality of the institutions that we had, the scientific institutions I'm talking about. That's going to be very, very difficult.
You have a note to white readers in your book.
Yeah. Did you like that?
Why don't you explain it? And what is that note?
Well, see, I've been organizing for a long time. I started in SDS in 1961, 62, Port Huron, and going before from that. And we thought it would be important to organize an interracial movement of the poor. We're always working with SNCC and doing interracial stuff. But within that, I always thought for myself that the task was to organize white people. Because black people can organize around white supremacy until the cows come home, but until white people put down white supremacy is going to be there. Well, that's our job. So let's just get that straight to start with. Now, the thing that I started to think, okay, in this book, what am I going to say to white people about this? And I just started to think, here's Frantz Fanon in Wretched of the Earth. And he writes in there that the oppressor knows nothing about the oppressed, but the oppressed know everything about the oppressor. And that is so true. And it is because the oppressed have to deal with the oppressor on a granular basis every day, and they have to know what's going to get them killed. So they have to know how to skate and who's who and what's what very carefully. The oppressor just treats the oppressed as an undifferentiated mass. They don't really know anything about it as long as they can control them. So if you want to know, say, about white people, don't talk to white people. Talk to black people. If you really want to understand white people, go read Jimmy Baldwin. If you want to understand white people, go read Frantz Fanon. If you want to understand white people, go read these people who know us in ways that we do not know ourselves. And so I went and I got some stuff out of Baldwin, actually. Some very, very profound stuff about white people. One of the things that, I mean, you can find it in here, but one of the things that I remember Baldwin said was, maybe white people don't want to give up, don't want to recognize their, their role because they're afraid of the pain that will come from that, from recognizing that white people will experience too much pain from recognizing what's the foundation of white supremacy. And that's a profound observation. And I think it's true. Or it has some truth in it, and we have to pay attention. So then I was writing that, and I was thinking about it, and then I thought, here's King, Martin Luther King, and famous "I Have a Dream" speech, right? And what was that? The tagline of that? Oh boy, that speech! I was there when that happened. It was a good speech.
You were there?
I was there. Yeah. October 28th, 1963.
Where?
In D.C. Of course, I drove from Ann Arbor and was there.
You mean August 28th?
Yeah. Did I say April or something?
October.
October, no, August 28th, 1963, I'm sorry. So in there, King says, and what's always repeated is the dream of when people will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Now, I heard that, and you hear it every year, and I always thought that he was talking about black people. That's, lift the burden of racism so that black people can be judged by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. But what I understood for the first time that it actually hit me like as an epiphany when I was writing this, he was talking about white people too. If white people go into a conversation with anything more than the content of their character, that conversation is over. White people have nothing to bring to any conversation except the content of our character. And if you really stop and think about that, what that means is, white people aren't the fount of civilization. White people aren't the fount of knowledge. White people aren't the fount of intellectual integrity or intellectual endeavor. It's just ridiculous. It's not true. And because it's not true, if we go into conversations, interracial conversations, with that mindset, that comes out in a flash to the people who are you're talking to, who are the oppressed, because they understand it in a way that we don't, but we have to. So that's what that note to white people is about, is that we have nothing but the content of our character, and then we have to have that character.
In this last section of this interview, Naomi Klein wrote the book, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. The question is, when there is a catastrophe, and some might think about this moment as that, who gets to control what gets created afterwards, what gets built afterwards? Or is it the Milton Friedmans, or is it the Zoran Mamdanis and others? That this could be a moment of incredible opportunity or just devastating destruction.
Well, that's the task, right? That's the question. That's the political task of the moment. And that's why I wrote the book, was to try to provide some kind of resource for people to be able to think through what is going on, because we don't know what the answer to that question is. You don't know.
Hold out hope, for example, on Saturday is major protests around the country.
Well, sure. There's 2,000 plus no King's marches around the country. That's great. And I'm going, and I suppose you all are going. I want to let everybody know that the Beacon is a group that shines a light every Thursday around the city of New York and around the country. I have little flyers here, and we're gathering to have a contingent at the Majestic Deli in Manhattan on 50th Street and 7th Avenue. And we'll be marching. The thing is, and this is another point that's in this book, we have to make a distinction between activists and organizers. What this thing is on Saturday, that's the activists going out. But you got to go home and organize. If we aren't organizing our communities to be active elements in creating the future, that's possible. Because the president is always pregnant with the future. It's just up to us to be the midwife of that going in the right direction. That's our task. Whether we do it or not, and how we do it and who we do it with, those are political questions. And that's what we're trying to do, I think, in this forum. I think that's what you're trying to do with your work. This book, when I was doing a lot of political work as a student, in SDS and other things, we were tearing up. We were active like mad, but we also read. We also studied. We also tried to walk on two legs of theory and practice. And how does the one influence and inform the other? That's what we have to do. And we have to take every possible resource and every possible avenue of investigation and activism to shape that future and to take this Mamdani moment. Now, everybody understands that when Mamdani is elected, the whole of the political apparatus is going to move to isolate him and undermine him.
I mean, President Trump has already talked about detention, deportation of the man himself.
Well, you don't even need Trump. All you have to do is Governor Hochul. All you have to do is the political leadership of the Assembly and the Senate in New York State. So what that says—
But Hochul, who has endorsed Mamdani.
Right. Well, she's endorsed him because she's running for an election next year and she needs votes in Brooklyn. So of course she endorsed him. But when it comes to push comes to shove, and
Hakeem Jeffries needs votes in Brooklyn, and he didn't endorse him.
Well, he evidently has bigger fish to fry. So, but my point is that this whole thing about can there be socialism in one country? Can there be democratic socialism in one city? The answer is probably no. You have to build on this. So this kind of politics has to be brought to Schenectady. It has to be brought to Buffalo. It has to be brought to Yonkers. It has to be brought all over the state of New York so that representatives who are in the Assembly and the Senate resonate with what Mamdani is trying to do to build the kind of society that we're talking about needs to get built. But if that doesn't happen, then we've got a lot of problems.
And what about Trump's threats? And what about the power elite's threats saying, fine, if he's elected, we'll make it impossible for him to govern?
Well, it's possible that that will happen and that, we'll all just be screwed.
But how do people shore up the city and ensure that that pressure is turned around?
Well, that's our task, is to organize the on every block, and on every community, in every constituency, to challenge what Trump is trying to do, not just to the city, but to the country. Not just to the Second Avenue subway and the tunnel going to Jersey for Amtrak, but the whole array of issues and policies that Trump is trying to push down in his fascist drive to transform this country.
What is he trying to transform it into?
His little fiefdom. People think what he wants is loyalty. I think that's a mistake. He don't want loyalty. He wants obedience. That's a very different thing. And I think that what he's trying to cook up is a society in which everybody will go seek Heil to him. I don't think it's anything much more complicated than that. Now, of course, that turns into complications. And is there somebody who will take his place that maybe doesn't have quite the same charisma? Who will take MAGA to the next stage, and what will that look like? We don't know. But what we do know is that if there isn't real organized democratic, socialist, in the sense that I've been using the term, mobilization and organization and knowledge and commitment among broad swaths of the population, it's going to be very bad.
In these last few minutes, do you think people's views of socialism have changed in this country? I mean, the way Europe has democratic socialist parties all over Europe, it hasn't been the same here.
Well, that's a whole discussion about why socialism doesn't have the same resonance here as in Europe. As the history of class and class struggle in the two places is quite different. But I think that the idea of socialism is being more in the public arena. It's out there more. It's discussed because of Mamdani.
And where would you say Bernie Sanders has weighed in on this?
And Bernie Sanders and AOC and all, you know, that whole wing, you could say, or a couple of feathers of a wing anyway, of the Democratic Party, it's there, and we need to build on that. We need to organize on that. We need to think about it, have these kinds of forums. And again, I have to come back. That's what this book, this one right here, Class, Race, and Gender, Challenging the Injuries and Divisions of Capitalism, is trying to be a resource exactly for that struggle.
Finally, what surprised you most in your research for this book?
What surprised me most?
You've been dealing with these issues for decades.
I think what surprised me most is that what King said has to do with white people. That was the epiphany, more than anything else.
Should we leave it at that?
It's fine with me.
So, Michael's going to be signing books. I encourage everyone to get it. What an incredible moment to really learn about these issues in the way that Michael Zweig has framed them. Thank you so much. Oh, and tune into Democracy Now!, democracynow.org.
For sure.
We do have some time for questions from the audience. If you guys have a question, just raise your hand.
Hello to both of you. So you talked about the ruling class using a divide and conquer strategy. Yes. Are there any divisions in the ruling class that we can exploit now? Also,
excellent question. I think the answer is yes. We have to discover them. And I think that there's elements of the ruling class who don't want fascism. They really don't. And if you see, again, I've said before, if you aren't doing politics with the people you can't stand, you're not doing politics. If you think about the history of reform, deep reform in this country, there is no example that does not involve a significant section of the ruling class wanting to go along with that reform. That was true of the Civil Rights Movement. That was true of the labor movement and the New Deal. That was true of the Progressive era. That was true of the Reconstruction. And we need to find that now. But as what I was saying before, if you have Liz Cheney in the lead for democracy, that's not what you want. Liz Cheney and the corporate elite that maybe could find a little bit of guts to stand up to Trump, we haven't seen too much of that yet. But they're there, and I think that we can go to them, work with them, but only if we have our own independent force. And then we'll see who's who and who comes out. But I do think that there are people in the ruling class who don't want fascism, who don't want to kowtow to this son of a bitch, and who are looking for a way out. We're the way out. There was a question right over here and then over there.
He had his hand up, and then I'll get to the other two.
Okay.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Amy. Michael, can you expand a little bit on the two corporate national parties versus a third party versus the movement, labor, student, tenant, etc., but in the context of what you might call the MAGA oligarchic takeover of the GOP establishment and of Jayapal, Tlaib, Kawant, and Mamdani's successes down ballot?
Well, I think that what you've got in the Republican takeover has its origins going way, way back. And they have chipped away over a long time strategically. And in the political realm, not the other realms of the Heritage Foundation, all that, but in the actual political realm, I think it goes back to Newt Gingrich. And Gingrich really saying that the Democrats are the enemy. And that started to get scary. And then when you had the crisis in 2008, 2009, and you had the Freedom Caucus type people and come forward. And you had the rebellion coming forward in 2009. That was so interesting because there were people all around the country who were saying, wait a minute, Wall Street, we want Main Street. Remember that whole Main Street, not Wall Street kind of thing against the bailouts and so on? But what happened was that there was some really smart and very well-heeled Republican money that went to all those different places in Tennessee and Arkansas and Michigan, Oklahoma, Washington State, and they said to those rebels, you guys need to know how to do politics. Why don't you come to Washington or, you know, in Northern Virginia, we have a conference we're organizing to show you how to do politics. To take that movement, that was a real populist movement that challenged corporate power and wanted to bail out from Main Street, which meant ordinary people. And what happened in 2009, 2010 was that there was a dedicated drive to recruit people who were willing to go in a right-wing direction. Those leaders at that time who were on the left were left aside. They were just ignored or crushed. And the Democrats didn't do anything with it. The Democrats didn't, and neither did the Democratic Socialists. No, we didn't talk to those people. But you know who did? Reverend Barber. Reverend Barber went up into the mountains in Tennessee and North Carolina and talked to white people and got white people to organize NAACP chapters. Well, that's because he went and talked about what was really going on to people in terms that they could understand and relate to. That's what Mamdani's trying to do now. That's what AOC was trying to do in 2018 when she took Crowell out of the picture. Crowley. That's the kind of politics that we have to do, is to build, again, that connection of electoral and movement. That's what we have to do. And, well, people say there's no money. You know, SNCC didn't have any.
I have a question, and how do you define class in America? In a country where, you know, income can change from day to night or from, you know, quickly in the same generation, where social classes are so metalled, you know, there's so many people from so many places, and ruling. I hear you talking about ruling class. I mean, it's clear in Europe what is or it's a bit more clear in Europe what is a class. For me, it's not clear what it is in the US. And if I may, my comment is about the difference to me between the first and the second Trump administration was how well organized they were. And are we organized the same way? Because we know since June, Mamdani is going to win this election, and we know that how do you say, the reply from Washington is going to be devastating. You know, we may not have pickup of garbages anymore or things like that because there's no funding. Are we organizing, preparing to survive a Mandani election?
Well, let me say to the question of what do I mean by class, that's a basic question. It's a good question. To me, class is a question of power. I don't think of class in terms of income or lifestyle or any other measure, but power. Now, power by its nature is a relationship. So class is by its nature a relationship. It's a relational phenomenon. The working class, I say, are people who basically go to work, who don't have much power or control over the work that they do. They work under supervision, close or distant. And they go to work, and they do their job, they go home, or they go to another job. That's the working class. Now, typically, we think historically in this country that the working class are people in heavy industry, factory workers, miners, construction workers. But there's an awful lot of service workers, you know, people who are in call centers, people who are home healthcare workers, people who are nursing assistants, people who are EMTs, people who are technicians of various sorts. Those are all working class people. And what I've done is look at the data that the U.S. Department of Labor presents on occupations. And I just like 800 different occupations. So I can tell you how many accountants there are, but I can also tell you how many bookkeepers there are. It's the difference between an accountant and a bookkeeper. It's the difference between a cook and a chef. So what I would do is go and look at the data, and what I found is that about 62% of the labor force in this country are working class people. They don't have a lot of control or authority over their work or the pace of the work. And that's, you know, driving a truck, doing whatever they do. But that's a relationship. They don't have the power. Who has the power? Well, that's their employers. That's the capitalists. They're the people who have the power. And so that is the relational class that's of significance to the working class. And that's about 2%. The boards of directors of the major corporations and the senior executives and so on. But there is a middle class of professional people, small business owners, and managers and supervisors. And that's about 35% of the population of the labor force. And that's been pretty consistent since the middle 1980s, which is the first time. I've been doing this for 40 years looking at these numbers. They haven't changed a whole lot in that whole period of time, which is really interesting. The particular composition of those different occupations is different. But the working class has been about 62, 63%. That's why the book was called The Working Class Majority, because we tend to forget. And that helps when you talk about democratic socialism and you bring the working class to power. That's the majority of the people of the country, if you can organize them. So that's how I define class, is in terms of power and those power relationships.
Overlaps with income a lot.
Well, it overlaps with income, but income is a consequence. It's not a definer. Right? That's what I think is important to say. So are we done here with questions? Do we have to be done?